neither side actually care about Yiren. We start off by saying that the Koreans were offensive and the Chinese were defensive. I still stand by it. However, neither side actually cares about Yiren. They care more about people adhering to their culture. This is the first slide.
Yeah, first slide.
What a great slide.
Yeah. I purposely made a picture of the first slide this time. All right, let's get right into it. One of the bigger controversies in the K-pop community this month surrounded Everglow's visual Yiren. This poor girl. She made a name for herself back in Produce 48, and she was able to be a very popular member in Everglow, even coming out on Running Man like twice. And now she's in the center of controversy, or more like being like in the middle of the political tensions that kind of defines today's relationship between Korea and China. Hello to everybody tuned in. You're listening to Offbeat Koreans. If you're interested in watching some of our previous podcasts, please check it out on our YouTube channel. And as always, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Just like last week, BM won't be able to join us, but he'll definitely be joining for next episode's controversy. So make sure to look out for that. Going back to our main topic, kind of give a background to those who don't know. Eden was at a face-to-face fan meet with the rest of her Everglow members, and at one point, the members did the traditional Korean bow before her fans. It's kind of the part of Korean culture of showing respect to people, and everyone did that except her.
It's for New Year's specifically.
Yes, for New Year's. This was also one of the first times that Everglow also appeared in front of their fans. And she was clearly spotted, shown in the picture, standing and putting her hands together instead of bowing like the rest of her members. And this one small act, this one picture alone, sparked an outrage in Korea, where she became the new target of anti-Chinese sentiment among the Korean public, a sentiment which I honestly believe seems to be getting worse. Koreans argue that she was not showing respect and that she was trying to push a Chinese agenda in their country. And then the Chinese kind of rooted for her and said that she was, there defending China's culture in a foreign country. Since in Chinese culture, you technically only bow before your parents, to your ancestors, and to the heavens, and not to strangers such as your fans. And I know Dubious kind of read up on this issue, so I gotta ask you, man, what's your thoughts on the Chinese and Korean reactions?
Okay, I have so much thoughts, but I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna share my screen.
Go right ahead. Oh yeah, let's see it.
All right, I've had a couple days to think about this. Okay, I've had a couple days to think about this because it's one of those things where it's such a complicated topic and people are making it very black and white. So for me, I was like, I had a thought that wasn't quite fleshed out, so I took a little bit of time to flesh out, and I'm gonna present it almost like a thesis. And I want people to let me know what they think, but I feel very strongly about this. Okay. So what this poor diagram shows, it's a representation of the current issue at hand, right? So we have the Chinese viewpoint on the left, and we have the Korean viewpoint on the right. And then we have Eden stuck in the middle of this debate. So, what this diagram shows is the situation at hand, which is a Chinese idol, a Chinese born and raised idol working in Korea, who is in the middle of a debate concerning cultural coexistence. I don't know if that's a actual phrase, but what I'm gonna mean for cultural coexistence is just it's a situation where a person constantly has to, or by the virtue of being a foreigner in a foreign land, has to constantly come to clash at situations where she has to make decisions that lean one more like Korean way or more Chinese way. That's what I'm gonna define as cultural coexistence. Okay, and this like ability for both to exist in harmony. Okay, but I want to add another detail to the slide, which is this.
Extreme.
2 points of views are actually both extreme, and they're both wrong. And so, someone might think, whoa, calm down, Dubious. The Korean viewpoint 100% extreme, right? Like there are people saying like, "Hey, go back to China." Like if you don't accept our culture, go back to China.
Right.
How is the Chinese viewpoint extreme? They're just defending. They're only protecting Yiren, right?
Right.
And what I want to say is, no, they are both extreme. The thing is, both sides of the argument, it's very dangerous. The Korean one, yes, it's explicitly dangerous. Why it's hard to see that they're both dangerous is because one is offensive and one is defensive. So the Korean view is offensive in this case, and the Chinese view right now is, or when I say Chinese view, I'm not saying all the like billions of people in China. I mean the people, the netizens online that hold this sentiment, right?
Right.
Or if you also fall on this side of the argument, you also have an extremist view. I'm gonna say it. You have an extremist view, and it's both just as dangerous. And the reason is because both sides, right, explicably or implicitly, explicitly or implicitly, demand that a certain correct behavior exists when it comes to how Iran should have acted in this realm of cultural coexistence. And so because both sides say, hey, there was a correct behavior for how things should have been done, there's actually no way Eden could have made a decision that both Chinese or the Korean netizens could have been satisfied in, and therefore she can never make any decision that will be in harmony with both sides.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, and so she will always be criticized by either side, whichever decision she takes, and that is first unfair. Okay. I think it's very clear why the Korean view is an explicit display of demanding correct behavior. They explicitly say, if you don't do this, then get out, right? So I'm not even gonna try to explain that side. If you don't get it, then go back to elementary. But I'm going to take some time to go through some of the sentiment that I've seen online that comes from the Chinese side, and one of the kind of explain why I think their side is also an extremist view and a dangerous view at that. Okay. Okay. So then on the Global Times, an article called "Chinese member of K-pop group sets example after refusing to kneel, sparking controversy." These are two sentiments I found. I see this online quite often. On one way, it might just be paraphrased in different ways, but these are more expanded views on certain takes. So let me see. Okay. So then I'm just gonna read through, or you can read through it, but I'm just gonna read through it as well. So Wang, or Eden, just went to South Korea for work, not to become a South Korean. She pursues her career in the country by spending a lot of effort in singing and dancing, which shows her love of K-pop culture. However, this does not mean she has to follow all South Korean culture. To seek harmony and diversity is a principle of our cultural coexistence. Shi Wangzhu, I think, a cultural critic based in Beijing, told the Global Times. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Okay, so everything here sounds fine because it seems like she's defending Iran.
Right.
And she kind of is and kind of not. And why that is because there's a problem with this. If you look at the highlighted parts, Shi Wangzhu, the cultural critic, actually draws a line between what is appropriate and what is not. The first point, which I highlighted, Shi Wangzhu says, Wang just went to South Korea for work, not to become South Korean. Okay, so now I want to ask the critic, what does it mean to be South Korean versus what's working in South Korea? Do South Koreans have to follow certain cultures, whereas foreigners are exempt from some? Okay, so if that's what you think, then where do we draw the line? What about speaking only Chinese in Korea? Should that be accepted and that should be embraced? If you're working in South Korea but you're not South Korean? If I change my citizenship to be South Korean, do I have to bow on New Year's the same way other South Koreans do? You know what I'm getting at, kind of. And so and then the second highlight part is, however, this does not mean Yiren has to follow all South Korean culture. Okay, so then if Yiren doesn't have to follow all South Korean culture, then are there cultures she is required to follow? If so, then what are they? And this is where the critic actually starts drawing lines where there are no lines. This isn't like written down rule anywhere. Like no one says, hey, if you're South Korean, you have to do this culturally. Hey, if you're just working in South Korea, you don't have to do this.
Yeah.
And so my takeaways from people who hold these kind of views is that the only person who actually gets to decide what they want to do / draw the line is Yiren, not Chinese or Korean netizens, nor cultural critics at that. And when you start drawing arbitrary lines for what behavior is appropriate and what's not, it doesn't actually help anyone. There is no clear answer. There's no rule. This isn't like, hey, you committed a crime, therefore you need to go to jail or you need to pay a fine. This isn't written down anywhere. So I don't like when people say like, oh, like she's not South Korean, she didn't have to do this. Okay, so then are there people who should be required to do this? Is anyone required to do this? And so the sentiment I kind of want to finish out with is saying Eden is exempt from any criticism because she's Chinese is a cop-out. And the reverse is the same. Saying Eden should bow the Korean way because she's in Korea is a cop-out. There's like, you need to be more specific. You need to point to me somewhere and say, hey, this is why she should have done this or that. Or else you're just arbitrarily drawing lines and say, yeah, she's fine. She didn't have to do it because she's not South Korean. And then not go into any detail.
Yeah.
Is there any questions from you on this slide specifically?
No, not yet.
Okay, so then I'll go to the second sentiment that was in the slide. This is by Zhang Peng, a film researcher at Nanjing University, who once paid a visit to South Korea's public television KBS, called on some South Korean netizens to be more rational and not to use their national values to morally kidnap foreigners. Wang has set a good example for Chinese entertainers developing their careers overseas, Zhang pointed out, knowing that he was glad to see Chinese entertainers have formed their own cultural values and identity while working overseas. They never forget their roots.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zhang, for a tear-jerking take. But let me ask you this. Okay, so then the problem is we come back to the original argument where Zhang actually, even though Zhang sounds like he or she is defending Eden, actually starts setting expectations for his correct behavior. So read this. Zhang says Wang has set a good example for Chinese entertainers developing their career overseas. Okay, cool. That's a good example. So then what's a bad example or not good? So then if Eden decided to bow the Korean way, Zhang, is that a bad example? Would Eden have forgotten her roots at that point? So everything here, like everything Zhang says about like, oh, they never forget their roots, like we're proud of this. Okay, but then you're proud of their actions. You're not proud of them. You're proud of them because they made the right decision in your eyes. Right? And that's where the problem really lies. And I think this paragraph, granted, I don't know if Zhang said this in Chinese and it was translated to English, and so maybe there was some mistranslation. But it's actually really funny because Zhang says South Korean netizens need to be more rational and not to use their national values to morally kidnap foreigners, and then immediately follows it up by morally kidnapping other Chinese by telling them what good example and good behavior looks like. Dude, I hope Eden doesn't forget her roots, or else she'll set a bad example.
Right.
And I think even it's kind of funny if you think about it. Even when she came out and gave when she bowed or celebrated New Year's with her Everglow mates, right? Okay, let's think about it. January 2nd isn't Chinese New Year's. It's not.
That's true.
Like, Chinese don't celebrate New Year's during that time typically. So then, did she forget her roots? Right? Did she forget her roots when she celebrated New Year's? Like,
that's a bad example.
Now, yes, that's a bad example. See, like, I'm getting really detailed, but I'm getting detailed because people are just generally tossing out phrases like, oh, we're proud because they followed this and didn't follow that, or like stood up for this and this. And it's just like, well, okay, but then what if she decided not to do that? Would you be not proud of her? Would you think that she didn't embrace her Chinese culture if she adopted the new one?
Yeah.
And I want to point out that the rhetoric is dangerous, right? And so like my overall reaction to this is that neither side actually care about Yiren. Like neither like we start off by saying that the Koreans were offensive and the Chinese were defensive. I still stand by it. However, neither side actually cares about Yiren. They care more about people adhering to their culture, and that's why I don't like it when people immediately go to the when a third party comes in and looks at the situation. It's very easy for them to see the Korean and the Chinese take and be like, oh wow, like the Koreans are really mean, right? Like they're attacking Eden, whereas the Chinese like netizens are defending Eden, and then be like, oh well, the Chinese must be correct. But it's not the case. You need to listen to the rhetoric and the words that they're speaking. There's a difference between supporting Eden and conditionally supporting Eden.
Yeah.
A lot of words are being spoken by the defenders or the Chinese netizens that are defending her actions that are correct, not defending her. So I want like if anyone that's listening to this feels kind of peeved by this or unsure, think about play this exercise with me. Think about what would happen if the roles reverse. Let's say Eden chose on January 2nd to bow down the Korean way, and Chinese netizens saw this, right? And let's say a Chinese netizen who was an extremist, who was a nationalist, decided to take this and put it on like Chinese Weibo or something and say, look at this Chinese girl who has given up her, Chinese culture, right? Don't you think the Koreans would have defended Eden? Don't you think the Koreans would have been like, oh well, like she's just trying to respect her fans and like just be nice, like we love Eden. You don't think the Koreans would have defended her?
Yeah.
And then what? At that point, the Koreans would be the good guys? No, they're not. They're not. Neither of these sides are good guys because they're not supporting Eden. They're supporting her actions and whether she does the correct thing. That's why I don't like it when people are like, oh, like in this occasion, the Koreans are wrong or the Korean netizens are wrong. No, they're both wrong. Unless you're supporting Eden and herself specifically, both sides are wrong, and neither side are actually helping lead towards a future where foreign idols can safely promote in K-pop. That's my long reaction.
Yeah, no, it definitely is kind of that sense of what's like kind of blind nationalism, blind patriotism, and it's causing Eden to be stuck right in the middle of the two sides. And for her, like the best decision to do is really just to pick one side rather than to piss off both. And we've seen this as a growing issue in the K-pop community. We've seen, take the screen back. Yeah, we've seen some veterans such as Jackson Wang, who used to be a fervently prideful Hong Konger, and then now he kind of switched to a full Chinese identity.
I wonder why.
Yep. And if you watch Girls Planet 999, you also know Suruichi, who was very popular amongst international fans, was heavily dispopular among Korean netizens, most likely because she voiced support for China during the Korean War. So then I also got to ask you this, Dubious. Do you think that these kind of problems are inevitable for now and future Chinese K-pop stars?
I think it's honestly inevitable for any foreigner that is operating in Korea or working in Korea, but it's going to be pronounced for trainees coming from China, I think, because and I'll say this first. Koreans are very nationalistic people. They're very proud of their country, and also they have a chip on their shoulder because the country itself went through a lot of hardships, and it wasn't only until like after the Korean War where they started having or they started to actually see themselves grow as a country. Like up until 1950 something, like Korea were a very poor and war torn country. It's not the Samsung, LG, like BTS country of now, and so they definitely have a chip on their shoulder. So this isn't an excuse for them. I'm just explaining why this issue happens quite often in Korea, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and with China, I think you have a country where I'm not Chinese, so I'm not gonna say this is why. I'm not gonna give any reasons to why I think it's factually this comes up often, but there's definitely historical tensions with Korea, and I think just more issues are popping up where either Chinese feel like Koreans are taking their culture, or Koreans feel like Chinese are taking their culture, and it's just like it's just ramping up. And what's happening is that and we can talk about this a little bit later, but the people on the extremes are the one that are driving the narrative. So the nationalist extremes on both sides are driving the narrative of what's happening. And when a third party or just a layman comes and sees the situation, they're easily swindled to one side or another, just because, if they're ethnically or nationally Korean, you're naturally gonna be side with the Koreans most likely. And if you're ethnically or nationally Chinese, you're more likely going to defend, your heritage. So yeah, I think it's inevitable. I mean, I think it's getting worse, and that's why I feel like covering topics like this, and even if 5 people listen to this part, I think it's important to at least let them know how we can make this better.
Yeah. Yeah, in the past, a lot of controversies usually tend to be around like between Korea and Japan, but we've definitely seen a shift towards controversies with China, and a lot of reasons maybe because again the Chinese government is very authoritarian. So in that way, a lot of these Chinese stars have to kind of drive their agenda to align with the Chinese government, otherwise they wouldn't be able to enter their country and live a free life. So there's that reason. And in the end, Yiren decided to go back to China. She cited reasons such as finishing her studies and hanging out with her family for the New Year's. But I think we kind of know what the real reason is for going back. And so, kind of to end off this topic, I wanted to ask what you thought would be the best course of action for Yiren. Like, should she leave Everglow? Is it best for her to speak up or stay silent? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, so let me kind of talk about a feature that I see where I feel like something or this could be better, and then I'll kind of talk about what I think people should do,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And so, kind of going back to my slides, now this is all just hypotheticals, and this is what I think could work, right? I mentioned before that people shouldn't conditionally, or the reason why both sides are extremist views is because they are conditionally supporting Eden. If she makes a decision that aligns with their cultural etiquette, then they will support her, and if not, they will oppose her, right? However, I don't think that's how we should be doing this. It's like, if you're like, for me, I'm an immigrant, so I've kind of experienced this as well. But like, I think people need to. I think there's 2 things that need to happen in any cultural coexistence situation. We need to know about our differences, right? So like, if the Chinese knew why the Koreans take this seriously, I think the situation could be better. And I think if the Koreans knew why Eden didn't bow like this, I think it'd also be better. Like, I think a lot of people are taking this at face value and saying, oh, she didn't follow this, or oh, she followed this, good or bad. But no, it's like, well, why did she not do this? Right? And I know people who are on either side don't care about this. But then this is for the listeners who actually want to make, you know, people like Eden and foreigners in K-pop be able to promote more safely. You need to understand why she did the action she did, right? And I think secondly is that I don't think in situations where foreigners have to decide between leaning more towards the country they're at or the country they're from, there's no correct decision. There's no correct behavior. I think where it ends is, hey, I may like what Yiren did, or I may not like what Yiren did, but I respect that she made the decision. And you can choose to support her, or you can choose to not support her for whatever reason. That's up to any consumer, right? But then I think where you need to draw the line is say, hey, I'm not going to say whether what she did was correct or not, because there is no correct answer. And I think at that point we might be able to move forward a little bit as a industry, and allow for these relationships to mend a little bit instead of just this like deep like hurt and like anger just like festering and just growing bigger and bigger like a disease, and ultimately it shows, it rears its ugly head in instances like Iran or whatever's going to pop up later in the future, with such trivial, like it's just going to be some trivial matter like this, and people are just going to lose their minds, and then of course the narrative is going to be driven by people on the opposite sides. Um, and I think the first part, where I say like we get educated on the differences on culture, I think this is where the company should do a better job. Like, I don't like the fact that the company is being silent on this. Like, the company said, "Oh, Yuden's taking time off to spend time with her family because she hasn't been able to do it because of COVID, the restrictions and whatnot." That's a cop out for me.
Yeah.
Like, you need to say like, "We understand this is an issue." Um, and I think they need to be the first barrier to not allowing the extremists to take narrative of this. I think they should come out and say, "This is why Eden chose to do this, and we gave her freedom to do so, and we support her. We support the decisions that she makes. This is the reality. The reality is that she's a Chinese, born and raised, who came overseas because she loved K-pop and wanted to be in a K-pop group. And I hope you can respect her decision." And I think that's what they should have said at least. I don't think that would have stopped either side from being mad. But I think at least when random people approach this situation, they could at least go to that source and read from the company and say, "Oh, okay, so this is what's going on," instead of letting either side take control of the majority of population and getting more people mad.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of the issues where she can't simply like apologize. It's not like one of those bullying accusations or anything like that. It's definitely almost like choosing a side. And so for her, it's something that she will eventually have to come to face and address to the public. Because right now, most companies, what they like doing is they just simply like staying silent on the issue and just say that, this person's having some issues, they're going to take some time off. But whenever it is that she comes to Everglow, if she does come back to Everglow, she's, the Korean public are going to be reminded of this kind of controversy, and it's just going to be a repeat. And so, yeah, it's definitely one of those issues where something has to be said, either from her or from her company.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't think the company's gonna let her speak on this. Unless it's like they draft it and then let Eden look at it and then Eden just okays it, and pretend like it came from her. But yeah, the company I think has to come out and own up to what happened and at least educate people on why the instant or why she acted the way that she did.
Yeah. You don't think she's gonna necessarily get out of Everglow and just work in China, do you? Or do you think that might be a possibility?
Okay, so the worst situation I see is that she leaves Everglow right now. I think that's the worst situation because that will just drive a bigger dagger into this relationship between China and Korea when it comes to the K-pop industry, right? I think there's a future where she goes to Korea, ultimately moves over to China like a lot of Chinese K-pop stars have done. And that's, I think, inevitable just because that's where her family is, and it's a big market, and she doesn't have to deal with this whole cultural coexistence problem in China. Like she could just embrace the Chinese cultures and not have to worry about getting, just straight up bombarded online from either side whenever she does something that's slightly more Korean or more Chinese, right? And so I will completely support her decision if she chooses to do that. I just hope she doesn't do it right now, just because I don't think it will solve the problem. If anything, it will just give the Korean extremists joy, and it will also give the Chinese extremists just more hurt and more anger towards the Koreans.
Yeah. And as a lot of Chinese K-pop stars who do end up going back to China, they do end up getting a good sort of popularity. So it definitely probably is on her mind as well, that she knows of going back to China and going to work there. And it's very unclear as to how long her hiatus will be. Her company hasn't said anything about that. But what is for sure is that this controversy will definitely leave a scar on her Korean career, and especially be a reference point to future controversies surrounding Chinese K-pop stars. And that is it for today. Make sure to check out our previous podcast videos on our YouTube channel. If you'd like us to discuss any other topics, please do leave your comments and opinions down below. And of course, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, y'all.
If anyone has any objections to what I presented, I would 100% be willing to take a look at it. I just want to know where people stand, and if you chose either side, why you feel like you're correct in that. And if we can come to a consensus where, this is what we should believe in, like both sides, and move together forward in harmony, then I'd be 100% willing to agree with you. I just don't see how both sides can coexist in harmony right now.
Yeah. Good one.
Thank you, everyone.